you come in and have a seat, we're ready to begin again. Thank you so much for your patience, and we've got a lot of good questions here. And so we're going to get right into them, and we're going to give each one about 7 minutes to, or the first one about 7 minutes to answer the question, and then give a couple minutes for each of the other two to respond or add anything additional that they need to, and then we'll move on to the next question. And the first one is for Rick. Since Romans 13 says that rulers are ordained by God, does that mean that all evil rulers we have had down through the ages is because of God?
That's a very common question, and one that definitely deserves to be addressed, because we look through the pages of history, and it doesn't matter which part of the globe you look at through the centuries, there are always figures who do not cut a great image of leadership and governance. And that's just to say those are the ones that we know about. Maybe more that we're not even told because records haven't been preserved or things were done in secrecy. But as far as Romans chapter 13 speaks, to reference that passage as the question does, it begins in verse number 1 by saying, the powers that be are ordained or appointed by God. So the question might really be, to what degree does that make God culpable for all of the behavior that anyone in a leadership position, they commit, their particular behaviors? And I'd actually like to branch the question just a little bit more because I think it deserves an extension. If we talk for just a moment about the Bible's reference to God's plans for husbands and wives, He speaks about the ways that husbands and wives ought to relate to one another, respect, kindness, their particular roles or responsibilities. Having established that plan, you know as well as I, and as well as God would know, that not every husband or wife is everything that they ought to be. The structure was put in place. The fulfillment of that plan is left open to every individual. The same thing might be said about parents in relationship to their children. It could be said of leadership in other aspects of life, just like it's spoken of with regard to civil government. It's one thing to say that God has established in forming the human race the ways that we ought to interact or to be managing ourselves in our particular relationships, to draw up the blueprint or plan of attack, you might say. But that by no means indicates that every person who fills that particular role of responsibility does as the Lord would have intended for them to do. You and I both know that simply doesn't happen. It's just that when we start talking about figures like a Hitler or a Stalin or a figure like that what they do is on such a grand scale and it's placed across such vivid screens for the world to see that it captures our attention. But in itself, it is a phenomenon not unlike thinking about an abusive parent, an abusive spouse, someone who does not behave well in any structure that God has implemented or that we know of. Our hope would be that by utilizing the right principles, that whether it's a parent, a husband or a wife, someone in a church, someone in a community, or someone on a national scale, that they would embrace principles of goodness and righteousness, which God very frankly, since the question comes out of this section, God very frankly puts forward and asks that every person be willing to embrace. In the verses that follow that observation, God has appointed the powers that be. He expresses His intention by saying that they're meant to be a support for the good and a means of checking or stopping forces that are evil or destructive. Now that's the intention from God. But whether or not any particular figure in a home, a family, a marriage, a school, a church, a nation actually pursues that is the decision that they themselves will have to make. And when they make them poorly, it is unfortunate, but they and those around them suffer. It's not very different, really, in a sense, from things that happen in a home. It's just that sometimes in a home they're on a smaller scale, or they're kept more private. It's still an abuse of a structure that God has implemented, originally intending it would be for the benefit or good of humanity. So if I were speaking to a figure like that, and they wanted to say, well, I've been put in this power or this position, what would we say? With great power comes great responsibility? There's no less a demand or a desire for righteousness to be exalted in a nation as well as in a home. This is not a means of excusing or making God culpable for leadership's failures to do what's right, because they are absolutely flawed or faulted if they choose to ignore principles of goodness and righteousness. The sad thing is, of course, that by the power of their position, many more people, it seems, will suffer as a result. Many more could be benefited, but if that ruler chooses very poorly, there are many more who would suffer, and it's because of their own personal decision-making given their position.
Wayne, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Just one quick thought relative to the idea of the overall theme regarding the existence of evil versus the existence of God. Are those two compatible? I would say that if in following the line of thought in this question and the idea that, you know, is there a God since these certain men can rise to power? Did He put them there? Realize that without God, there's no final retribution or accounting for all that those men have done and all the evil that they've inflicted. Atheism would cry that they might be proof that God doesn't exist, or that they might be a blight on His character because of His allowing them to rule or even putting them in the position. But atheism still doesn't have an answer for the fact that those men are just going to die like everyone else, and without repenting of it, seek or have no other consequence. But theism says that there is a God who watched and saw it all, and there will be a retribution given. There will be vengeance taken on the pain that was inflicted by those men. Christianity offers that. None of the other solutions to pain and suffering have that in it.
Dan?
We need to remember that Romans 13 was written against the backdrop or on the canvas of the Roman Empire.
That's right.
And there has been very few governments that were more corrupt or anti-Christian at times than the Roman Empire. And yet even so, the Holy Spirit through the Apostle Paul tells brethren that we are to literally place ourselves under, and that's the meaning of this concept of be subject to. Place yourself under the government. We can think about individual rulers that have abused their authority. We need to remember that the government principle has been set into place or ordained by God. And there have been men to come along down the pike that have abused the government principle, even to the point of hurting millions and millions of people. That does not negate the need for the government principle, nor does that in and of itself suggest that God did not know what He was doing.
That's right.
The fact that someone abuses what is in place does not mean that what is in place is wrong. And the one that put it there is wrong as well. What we need to do, I think, in going back to Romans 13, is not question God and God's involvement in government, but revisit my place in government and see what Romans 13 teaches me to do in Romans 13 and similar passages in response to the government that encapsulates me. And I can see that I'm to be to subject myself to it. I am not to fear because of the way I respond to it. And I am to, verse 7 says of this same passage, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor is due, which suggests that in the government principle, there will be rulers to come along who are not due honor, who are not due respect. But those who are due honor and who are due respect need to receive the same from me. And by the way, those are the words that precede the passage that says, owe no one anything except to love. And so I am to make certain that I have the affection that I should have for others, regardless of what government encapsulates me.
Okay.
May I?
Yes.
Appreciate the comments, and one last thing I would offer based upon listening as well. In the absence of God, there is no way to say that we can lodge a complaint. It was not too long ago that an editorial was submitted to the newspaper in Austin, I read, and it was from a history professor at a university here in America, and he said that he was astounded because for the first time that he, in his teaching career, which had been some years, he had had students who entered, freshman and sophomore level students who entered, who would not say that what Hitler did was wrong. The best that they could say was, or the most they would commit to is, I wouldn't do it. But you throw God out, or you remove that, there's no room to criticize the government anyway.
right.
All you have is the expression of preference by the one most capable of enforcing what they want. The whole ability to evaluate in a moral position, to say this is right or this is wrong, this is horrific or this is commendable, presumes that there's something that is higher than our own decision making that actually is a measuring stick for right and wrong. And that only arises with God. And to take that away, why would we complain? All we could say is, it's not what I would do, and I would move somewhere else.
With God, without God, there is no morality.
That's exactly
We're
right.
just a compilation of molecules that happen to look this way in contrast to roadkill.
Exactly right. And so, atheists in the middle of the 1900s, Albert Camus and others speak up and they will say, if this plays out, then human beings are no better than a cockroach. Those are their words, not mine. Another figure like that was Czesław Miłosz, a poet, professor at Berkeley, who passed away just about 9 years ago, who was a young man and a publisher when Hitler invaded his native Poland, and then was there in Poland area when the Red Army followed, and so he now was subject to the regime of the Soviets and Stalin. It didn't cause him to say there is no God. What it caused him to recognize is that's not the solution to the problem. That is a compounding of it. And he helped other people to reconsider their atheist position.
Thank you. Wayne, does God use disasters like tornadoes and hurricanes, acts of terror, to punish people who are evil?
First, just one clarification regarding the question so that we're clear, and obviously not implied by the question itself, but perhaps is often connected to it. And that is that not all disease and disaster is a result of personal sin. John chapter 9, Jesus encounters a man who's blind, and the Pharisees want to know who sinned, this man or his parents. They just assumed that his blindness was due to sin. I think the book of Job, that's been referenced already and probably will be more times in our discussion today, is a testimony to that. We're given a behind-the-scenes look, and so the tragedies and the natural disasters in the book of Job early on are not connected to sin that Job committed, although his friends thought so, and Job perhaps even pondered at times why. It was not the case. The cross is the greatest example of that.
That's right.
Jesus went to the cross because of sin, but not his own. And so, while there are disasters and natural disasters that do result from sin, it's not always the case. Now, I suppose the question is, are all natural disasters a result of that, or are some? Well, we know for a fact that God used natural means, His natural law, to punish and chastise nations throughout history. Isaiah 45 verse 7 says, I formed light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. He owns that. He doesn't shy away from it. He accepts that responsibility. In fact, the Old Testament books are full of those instances. In the book of Jonah, God hurled a storm onto the sea. In the book of Exodus, He sent the 10 plagues. In 2 Samuel 24, when David had numbered the people, and God gave him a choice of that which would hurt his people, he chose the pestilence, and the Bible specifically says the Lord sent pestilence. And several thousand died because of that situation. And so, yes, God uses natural disaster. He certainly has. But I think it is important for us, if we're going to speak for God, that we have some certainty about the things that we're going to say. The reason that I can say that God caused the storm in the book of Jonah is because God told me. that he calls the storm in the book of Jonah. The reason I can know that God sent the pestilence of 2 Samuel 24 is because God told me he sent the pestilence of 2 Samuel 24. Back in the book of Job, toward the end of the book, when Job is being vindicated before his friends, God turns and he says in verse 7 of the last chapter, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. I find it personally amazing that in a book about suffering, that the world speaks, a subject about which the world speaks so freely and either charges God or defends God without certainty, that in that type of book, God says, I was listening to everything you said about me. I was listening to all the accusations you made at me and about Job, and you didn't say what was right. I don't want to be guilty, nor do I want any of us to be guilty, of speaking for God where God hasn't revealed. And so when it comes to something like Hurricane Katrina, is there a pattern of God's behavior to say that God had used that type of tragedy to chastise and warn nations in the past? Yes. Is it possible that God had used that tragedy to warn and chastise a nation now? Yes. But to say of certainty that God did those things, I don't believe we have the right or the revelation to speak to that. I'm not, again, trying to defend if God had done it. He is sovereign. And if he had chosen it, then it would come to pass, and I wouldn't argue with him. But I find it very difficult to say of absolute certainty that when a natural disaster occurs, that's God chastising. And I think one of the reasons that's difficult is because we are alarmed, aren't we, at how progressively sinful our nation is becoming. And so we as a moral people who are horrified by the blatant display of immorality in our country then assume that if God chastised other nations that way, he must be chastising ours. But I would remind you that every generation in which God's people have lived has been evil, and they've had problems. And not every natural disaster throughout the course of those generations has been by the hand of God. And so while the possibility is, yes, God sent natural disasters and still does, without accurate factual revelation, I don't purport that we should suppose to speak for him and charge that to his account unless he claims it himself.
Dan, would you like to add anything?
We find ourselves in the arena of providence when we think of God working in the world today. And so frequently we want to think of providence as something that is positive. At the same time, it can be negative. But when it comes to providence, there is absolutely no way from our vantage point, without revelation from God, to say, this is God's doing. Years ago, I heard a fellow preacher and a friend of mine, his name's Wayne Jackson. He lives out in California, and he was talking about providence. And he made this statement. I was just a young preacher. He said, providence is a provable, non-provable proposition. And in response I said, say what? And what he was saying is, you can turn to the Bible and you can prove from the Bible that God does function providentially. That is, God involves himself in the natural laws of the world and manipulates them to accomplish his purpose. But you cannot, without God telling you, say with certainty, God did that, or God did not do that. One of, I think, the best illustrations I know in talking about providence is for me to tell you I prayed for the woman who now is my wife to be my wife. She is now for 42 years. Mm-hmm. But I prayed to God, and I asked God to give Diane to me as my wife. And she said yes when I asked. Now, can I be bold enough to say God providentially gave my wife to me and said yes to my prayers? It might be that there was some woman over there that was saying, God, please don't make Dan my husband. Now, did he answer that woman's prayer, or did he answer my prayer, or did he answer both prayers at the same time in the same way? Who's to say? That's providence. Could I read two passages on this note, and then I'll pass it on? Romans, and I think this sums up everything about human suffering. Romans chapter 9 says, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? Paraphrase. Who are you? Who am I to question God? 1 Kings tells us that heavens and the heavens of heavens cannot contain him. Isaiah 66 tells us that heaven is his throne and the earth is his footstool. God encapsulates an ever-expanding, running down universe and penetrates the same. Who am I, who are you to question God? A potter says, I'm going to take this clay and I'm going to make a plate. He takes this clay and he says, I'm going to make a pitcher. The clay can't say, no, I don't want to be a plate, I want to be a pitcher. The pitcher can't say, what do you mean making me a pitcher? I want to be a coffee mug. That's the same way, same thing involved in you and in me questioning this God that encapsulates and penetrates this universe in which we live. We have no right to question him. And so Job 38 is God responding to a man who dared to do that. And he says this to Job, Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? What do you mean talking to me? You don't know what you're talking about. Now prepare yourself like a man. Man up, boy. I'll question you and you shall answer me. I'm going to ask you some questions, God says to Job. Would you like to be in that hot seat? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? In other words, God is saying to Job, if you want to question me, fine. Answer my questions first. Because surely you understand and know the answer to these questions. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking me your question. By what right are you allowing this to come into my life? We have no right to answer God. And that gets me right back to what I was saying earlier. You and I have a choice to make. It's not to question God, his existence or his benevolence. The choice is whether or not we are going to believe in and trust in him, whether we can understand why things happen or not.
Rick, would you like to add anything? Okay. Dan, would it be wrong to bring a child into this world knowing how evil this world has become? Possibility that that child might grow up and become evil, or even his life cut short. And along those lines, what would you say to someone who's experienced the death of a child that way?
Two questions.
Yeah.
In response to the first question, would it be wrong to bring a child into this world? How did the rest of that go?
Knowing how evil the world
Knowing
is.
how evil the world is. God did. Second question, what would you say to someone who has lost a child? Is that... David is described by God himself as a man after God's own heart. God said, there's never been anybody like David. David lost a son. My God, why have you forsaken me? I wonder how God felt about those words. God himself lost a son. What do you say to someone that loses a child? It's happened before. it'll happen again. You find yourself in a unique fraternity. Use it as an opportunity to develop faith in the hearts and the lives of people who know tragedy. Don't turn on God. Turn people to God. The loss of a child, like any disappointment or difficulty, is an opportunity to prove what God and what Jesus can truly mean to a human being in life and in life hereafter.
Rick, would you like to add anything to that?
Not long ago, had the chance with my family to be with someone in this very situation. There was nothing that I could say that would make the pain go away. You and I do not possess the words of wisdom to soothe their emotions and make it all disappear. It is sobering to think that when you sit there, you can't think of what to say, and that's exactly right, because there's little except to be supportive. That's still not enough, probably. To give an enduring sense of support and love. And there is no way, well, I said at the very beginning of all of this, we're sitting in a comfortable auditorium where many of the issues we're talking about are out there. They may be in our lives, but for right now, they're out there. It's easy to talk about it now. There is no rational conversation to have immediately with someone who's lost a child, it would seem to me. But the one thing that I would simply say, not only all the things that Dan just spoke are so true, but the other is the recognition that there's not anything. It's not a burden you and I should have to shoulder, to feel, because it isn't one that we could possibly carry. The thing that we could convey is an emotional encouragement, a support, a love, and a sense of commiseration to in some way salve a little bit by the presence of others. You'll notice in the beginning of the book of Job, when he suffered the loss of his own children, his grandchildren, all in one day, by the way, the fullness of loss, if you will, and then couple that with his own physical well-being, his friends showed up and they spent a long time not saying anything. In fact, it's an ironic twist that things got worse when they opened their mouths. And so, from the side of the one supporting, I would say that it's good to be present and to be supportive and not feel as if there's some golden phrase that I can use that will make everything better. That simply doesn't exist.
You know, Rick, in response to that, as someone that's walked that path,
Sir.
I learned that you don't remember anything anyone says when they come at that time of tragedy.
Yeah.
But you remember faces.
Good.
You remember those who did come. And I remember more than anything else something that I've tried to put into practice, and that is to just be there briefly and to say, I just want you to know I love you. And that means everything in the world to somebody, to know that someone cared enough to come by and simply say, I have no answers, I have no quick little cliche, but I just want you to know I love you. And that really does, that helps.
Wayne?
Just a word. Obviously, as one who's not experienced that type of loss, I think we know better than to even assume internally that we can imagine the pain. And I would even say that in regards to the stage in life in which you lost a child. One who's lost a child at a young age has different struggles and burdens to deal with in reconciling that loss. A child who's grown but yet doesn't outlive his parents, her parents, also has difficulty, but the two are not the same. So I would suggest not assuming that even if we've suffered that in one way or another that we know the pain that another person is feeling. I will say that in the loss of the 3-year-old boy I mentioned earlier, his father has told me on one occasion that one of the things that brings him a smile is to think that in his mind Ethan can be anything. He didn't grow up and choose a career path. He didn't become a preacher or a fireman or a doctor. But in Jason's mind, Ethan could have been anything, and that gives him hope. It gives him comfort. Just his way, one of his ways of coping. But in the end of the Revelation 22, when what is believed by most to be a description of heaven, the Bible says that the tree of life, verse number 2, is on either side of the river. And that tree isn't mentioned in the scriptures from the book of Genesis, not in reality, until the book of Revelation. The Bible says that on that tree were the leaves for the healing of the nations. Whatever our tragedy is, whatever our loss we've suffered, in heaven God has a leaf for that. And He can then take that pain away. And living with that hope, perhaps, is the greatest comfort during that time.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question before our first break, or before our next break. But if you if you need a question card or something, if you raise your hand, we have some extras over here to pass out. And during this last question, the ushers will come by through and pick up the any questions that you might have. But Rick, this one goes to you. God told Jeremiah the prophet that He had a specific plan for him from his womb. Does He have a specific plan for each one of us individually?
We're also told that in the book of Galatians chapter 1 that it was revealed to Paul that God had selected him from his mother's womb. Right. And Paul fought against that for a great deal of time. Even has the confrontation where he's told, it's hard for you to kick against my prodding or my poking, Acts chapter 9. On the other hand, everyone else, think about how many other times people are not told, this is your purpose, this is your goal, this is your reason for being here in any direct or specific way that talks about them. So on the one hand, we could say that God may have some expectations or plans with a person's name on it, but given no indication of His thoughts, I don't know what those might be. On the other hand, I would draw upon the imagery that it makes God appear in the Scriptures, presents Him as a parent, as a father. He's used that type of illustration numerous times and even makes comparisons with the way human or earthly parents operate. With our own children, 3 of them, I know the principles that I would encourage them to live by. I know the things that I would like to equip them with so that whatever the future holds for them, then they can face the future successfully. And I mean viewing from the right perspective. You know, you and I teach our children to always say please and thank you. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Don't talk to strangers. Always tell the truth. Those kinds of... And so what we're doing is we're arming them with the pieces of information and the guidance that will help them with whatever it is they face. And when I read through the pages of the Bible, that's what I see God doing with people. I don't know necessarily what He's got in the back of His mind or hidden from me about me. I don't know. But what I do know is that there is a general plan that I'm intended to follow, and every human being is. We're told in Ephesians chapter 1, for example, 3 times in a series of verses, 6, 12, and 14, that the reason for our existence is to live to the praise of His glory. It's a very specific statement, but coming from the one who says, I fashioned all human beings in my image, Genesis 1. There was a bumper sticker I saw in the back of a car in Austin that simply said, "Why are we here?" ? It did not have an answer after it. It had nothing else. Now, I would never deface anyone's cars or automobiles. You've got to respect people's things. But there was a part of me that wished I had a bumper sticker to put an answer at the end of that. Because we come up with the questions, every generation does. That doesn't mean we always know what the right answer to be is. But in this case, why am I here? I'm to live to the praise of God's glory.
Amen.
If you think about all of creation, Genesis 1 and 2 says God is an artisan of the highest order. If I ask you what part of creation is not fulfilling the intention for which it was created, there's only one exception, one item, and it's human beings. Trees grow in Texas and in Australia exactly the way that God intended. The stars in the heavens do exactly what they're intended to do. And whether we like the hurricane that hits the coastline or not, it's just the way our physical world is ordered. Gravity works repeatedly at 9-point-something meters per second squared at the surface of the earth. The only portion of creation that has a problem with executing its reason for being is the human being. If I can understand the goal to achieve great things, if I can understand the principles to operate by, then I can know very clearly God has a purpose for my life. Now, that is not to say that my purpose has been delineated and is going to be revealed in any more detail or differently than your purpose, but I don't even think I need that. God has taken a rational person, a thinking person, you, me, our neighbors, and with the right education and information has helped us to think about how we ought to live, just like we equip our children. Always say please and thank you. God speaks to us. Overcome evil with good and other principles that give us the guidance we need and a real reason for our existence.
Wayne?
Working with a congregation closely connected to a college campus, we get several students that come in every year, and the question will inevitably be, what is God's plan for my life? They'll want to know, what degree plan should I take? Who should I marry? Where should I live? And, we try to do our best to match them up there so that we know who they're marrying and keep them there with us so we can know what they're doing. But that's a question a lot of young people have. What's God's plan for my life? And I think it's confusing to some to read the Scriptures and see God hands-on with Abraham, hands-on with Moses, revealing things and even pushing them in ways that He doesn't reveal and push us in. And so am I missing out? Am I never going to know? And they wander aimlessly through life. Again, I go back to the premise that unless God reveals something, I can't know it, and I can't say it of certainty. And so we look for Scriptures in the New Testament, which is the Christian's doctrinal guidebook, description in the New Testament of what God's will is for any man. There are at least 4 things that are specified in the New Testament. It is God's will that I be saved from my sins. 1 Timothy 2, 3 and 4. It's God's will that I live a Spirit-filled life. Ephesians 5, 17 and 18. It's God's will that I be sanctified continually. 1 Thessalonians 4, 3. And that I say thank you. 1 Thessalonians 5, 18. If I do those 4 things, I will not be part of that created element not fulfilling my purpose, because God will be glorified in my decisions. And it will not matter then if I believe God has a specific person for me to marry or job to have or house to live in. I'll have done those things that He said were His will for me, and then He will bless as a result.
Dan? All right, we will stand adjourned for about 5 minutes. Again, and if you have questions, you bring them to me, or you get one of the cups of water or something back. Appreciate your attention.